Welcome back. My name is Anja Bojanic, for those who don't know me, and I will actually introduce our speaker and moderate, let us say, the discussion that will follow afterwards. Magali Besson is coming from the Sorbonne, Paris 4 University.
Paris 1.
Paris 1, sorry. And her topic will cover the social ontology of racialized groups, political but not metaphysical. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So I want here and now to take seriously the questions raised by the argument of the conference. That is, how does a group constitute itself? What holds it together? What type of specific collective engagement with the world being with a group or the awareness of membership in a group may produce? But I want to assess these questions with two specific angles, so to speak. And the first one is methodological. I'll approach social ontology from political philosophy, so doing a bit the opposite of what you just did from philosophy of mind. My second point of entry concerns the particular type of groups on which I'll focus. So that's races or racialized groups. My questions will be, what kind of groups are racialized groups? What holds them together? What type of specific collective engagement with the world does the belief in the existence of racialized groups, in personal membership in specific racialized group may produce? So in the vast literature on the metaphysics of race, or so-called metaphysics of race, which is a big field in the US, notably, that has been burgeoning since the beginning of the 21st century, Ron Mallon already argued in his 2006 ethics paper entitled Race, Normative, Not Metaphysical or Semantic, that the main tendency has been to consider that the answer to the ontological question, what kind of groups are races, is decisive in order to solve the normative question, what should we do with races? Broadly speaking, regarding the first ontological question, researchers have usually positioned themselves along two main alternatives. Are races real kinds or are they nominal kinds? The first alternative, in its turn, is divided between two branches. If races are real kinds, are they natural real kinds or are they social real kinds? And hence the different answers to the questions give rise to three main positions in the field. One, skepticism about races. Races are nominal kinds, they don't exist, strictly speaking, any more than wizards or witches. And that's typically a position famously defended by Kwame and Anthony Appiah. Two, thin racial naturalism. So races are natural, real kinds. They are biologically salient populations. Robin Andressen and for a while Philip Kitcher also endorsed this position. And it's in this renewed thin naturalist perspective, it is important to underline that the biological grounding or nature of races does not have any bearing on the cultural, intellectual, moral, cognitive properties of racial groups. So the thin naturalist perspective does not defend racial essentialism. And third position, social constructivism. Races are social real kinds. They were socially and politically constructed, and now they exist in our social reality. And Sally Haslinger is one of the most prominent representatives of this stance. So this is a very broad sketch, and things, of course, have been blurrier than this, but these three main ontological views still are mostly representative of the organization of the field. Now, do these ontological views translate into three different, well-delimited, and easily identified normative views? According to Ron Mallon in his 2006 paper, and I quote, typically there is a close association between metaphysical positions on race and normative positions on race talk. His normative question is, what ought we do with race talk? By which he means, and I quote again, the practices of using terms like race, white, black, Asian, and Hispanic, and their associated concepts, to label and differentially treat persons, end of quote. And he dubs the question normative because it is, and I quote again, action guiding and may involve a wide range of moral, semantic, prudential, or other considerations, end of quote. So in his perspective, the race skeptic normatively is an eliminativist. That is, he claims that we should not keep using the race talk for good epistemic and normative reasons, because race talk seems to support the notion that races exist, which for the skeptic is false, and it is, and it has been, and it still is, subjectively, intersubjectively, and objectively harmful. The racial naturalist and the social constructivist, on the other hand, again in Mallon's approach, both support what he calls conservationism. That is the view that race talk is permissible, even desirable, although they both support it for different reasons. The racial naturalist claims that races are scientifically sound and that pretending that they don't exist gives room to, and I quote here geneticist David Bleich, gives room to a vacuum that gets filled with pseudoscience. So Bleich recently argued in a New York Times editorial on last March 23, arguing that no substantial differences among human populations are possible will only invite the racist misuse of genetics that we wish to avoid. And that's the reason why he thinks that we should have race talk. The social constructivist, on the other hand, claims that the biological or genetic soundness of race is absolutely irrelevant, but that race talk is indispensable in order to name and evaluate attitudes and behaviors that are racially motivated, whether these attitudes and behaviors are enhancing or reducing racial inequalities. My normative question here slightly differs from Mallon's. To the extent that I'm interested in race talk, my considerations are not semantic per se, and I'm not here focusing on ordinary language theory. I'll not wonder, with a question that is really important in the field as well, what is in our mind when we say race? I'll rather wonder, is race a relevant, useful political category in order to describe and evaluate our social reality and fight against inequalities that are somehow racially motivated, or that we have to be able to identify as racially motivated. Or argue that the connection between ontological stances and normative political views is not as straightforward as Mallon seems to consider. And I'll defend a constructivist position that leads to a third normative standpoint, which I'll call transformationism, which, in my opinion, is much more coherent with our social reality. And I'll suggest that the normative coherence of transformationism speaks in favor of social constructivism. So first, racial naturalism. Contemporary racial naturalism does not, and again it's important, evidently, support the idea that races are human essences, or that they signify a system of external and internal properties attributed to human beings and able to ground their grouping and division into subspecies. There's a thin naturalistic approach that is not prone to consider races in terms of properties or characteristics or traits shared by all members of the racial group and only members of the racial group. The most convincing approach on these lines is populationism. Based on a cladistic approach, its tenets propose to call race a population situated dynamically on a phylogenetic tree, which has remained long enough in reproductive isolation. This continuous reproductive behavior, based on group preferences, gives the different populations enough genetic distance to be able to speak of different races or clades, I don't know how to pronounce that in English. Hence, for instance, Robin Andreessen's famous definition is the following, and you have it on the handout. The cladistic concept defines race in terms of a single relational property, genealogy, rather than in terms of shared intrinsic properties, phenotypic and genetic similarity. Cladistic races are ancestor-descendant sequences of breeding populations that share a common origin. End of quote. From a normative political point of view, many tenets of the thin naturalist approach insist that races, thus apprehended, are useful categories in order to develop racial policies aiming at implementing a more just social organization and at promoting equality. And this, for instance, is the claim of race-based medicine in the United States. Consider the well-known case of Bidil, the race-based pharmaceutical for congestive heart failure approved by the Food and Drug Administration for targeted marketing to African Americans in 2005. The approval of the FDA was based on two arguments. One, standard drugs appeared to be less effective in African Americans than in the rest of the population. And two, because of certain characteristics of the African American population in the US, Bidil worked better than other drugs for preventing heart attacks in this group. So let's leave aside issues with the protocol, the randomized trials conducted to establish the efficacy of Bidil in the target population. If we take at face value the normative arguments from the FDA, in the name of which the drug was produced and marketed, this does indeed remedy a flagrant inequality in prevention and access to healthcare for a racially identified section of the population, particularly vulnerable to heart disease. In the words of Sally Haslanger, on the naturalist view, it is as politically important for the FDA to address the biological implications of race differences as it is to address the biological implications of any other genetic differences that have medical implications. In fact, to ignore the real differences between the races would be a form of injustice. End of quote. However, other naturalists point that the development of so-called racial science has historically, in the majority of cases, served the purposes of expansionism, slavery, colonialism, genocide, and resorting to nature as a principle of order and explanation in human organization has historically played a major role in justifying inequalities. Hence, some racial naturalists today claim that there is a deep dichotomy between race in scientific discourses and race in lay or political discourses. Race talk is context dependent, and many ambiguities arise when speakers undermine the difference between what Quaishon Spencer called biological races and folk races. Spencer, hence, has recently come to support what he calls radical racial pluralism, a view according to which, and I quote, our claims about race being real must be both extremely contextualized and deflated in their metaphysical importance, end of quote. Races as populations or clades may be used in scientific contexts, but one does not necessarily need to refer to race in order to undermine inequalities. Returning to the Bidil case, it is questionable whether the objective of justice pursued in this instance requires the kind of racial categorization that is practiced by the American administration in the population census. As many have highlighted, the particular characteristics of the Bidil target population might equally result from social characteristics associated with the existence and effects of racial classification and its history in the US. Stress, poor diet, limited access to decent health care, etc. Based on this argument, some racial naturalists advocate a prudential position and consider that while races may be biologically real, this does not offer a good or sufficient argument as to why racial groups, that is, groups officially categorized along racial administrative labels, should be the specific targets of public policies. The latter should be designed for all any member of the political community. So thin racial realism or natural racial realism can thus be used to defend politics of identity based on race or colorblind policies. The relation between the ontological position and the normative position is far from straightforward, and the normative question, what should we do with races, seems in fact independent from the ontological question, at least when the latter's response is natural realism. What about, and it's my second moment, racial skepticism? A racial skeptic denying that races are real may consider that for that specific reason, races should be eliminated from law and public policies, and this is, for instance, and paradigmatically, the strong French Republican view on the matter. And this view just recently culminated into the proposition, unanimously passed at the National Assembly last July, to change the wording of the first article of our Constitution in order to suppress the word race that used to appear in the article. The article read, France shall be an indivisible, secular, democratic and social republic. It shall ensure the equality of all citizens before the law without distinction of origin, race or religion. End of quote of the fifth Constitution. In this formulation, race referred to an illegal political category whose use was illegitimate to ground any legal distinction between French citizens, regardless of the aim of the distinction. But the recent arguments in favor of the suppression of the term in this article suggested that the very formulation of the principle still seemed to validate race as a descriptive or conceptual category. Hence, the defendants argued that because race is scientifically unsound, because it does not have any biological reality, because it is a fiction, the term race should be banned from the Constitution and our legislation. We should do nothing with races because races don't exist. The racial skeptic, though, may just as well choose to respond to racial discrimination with affirmative action policies, which start with assigning people to racial categories. And this is, for instance, Kwame Apia's stance. On the one hand, for Apia, and I quote, I have already declared myself very often on the question whether I think there are any races. I think there aren't. But on the other hand, and I quote again, Apia, it is justified to treat people as if they had races, even when we officially believe that they don't, end of quote. In some instances, mentioning people's race can be the normatively right discourse when it serves to identify and undermine an already racially inegalitarian racial order, a social order, in order to repair current injustices based on racial assignation, in order to respond to direct or indirect racial discrimination, in order to fight against racial stigmatization, and so on. So the normative political choice actually depends on different worldviews, whether the skeptic assumes that the categories that shape and norm our social reality should or not mirror scientific categories. Hence, racial skepticism may lead to eliminativism or conservationism, at least in some cases. The reason why racial naturalists and skeptics may similarly endorse various normative positions while defending opposite ontological views regarding the reality of races is that they share a common premise. For both of them, if race exists, or if races exist, they are natural kinds. And the naturalist says they do, and the skeptic says they don't. But the premise is the same. And this, I want to advocate, and this is my third moment, for a third approach, a social constructivist approach, for which if races exist, they are social kinds. In this perspective, the reality of race doesn't reside in biology, but in socio-historical and political relations produced by practices based on our beliefs about race. Race, like money, like state, like socio-professional categories, is a social fact. This perspective, in my opinion, is actually the only one that can coherently support the metaphysically skeptic but normatively not colorblind position, that is Appiah's position. In ontological terms, the question becomes what type and what degree of reality have objects such as money, nation, race, objects which are social and political and not reducible to physical or biological facts which belong to social categorization. So several steps need to be taken. First, I suggest that these are institutional facts in John Searle's terms. That is, they belong to this subtype of social facts which can't exist independently from human institutions and only exist within a system of constitutive rules. Second, racial groups belong to what Ian Hacking calls interactive kinds. This kind of objects is very specific insofar as the objects and the ideas or categories that classify them are in interaction. This is what Hacking calls the looping effect of interactive kinds. Persons who are affected by the category reciprocally affect the category by explicitly or not adopting, rejecting behaviors, modes of life, values, and considered categories that are considered as good adjustments to the meaning of the new meaning or the renewed meaning of the category. Institutionalized categories transform the experience individuals have of themselves, interactions with others, and feelings and behaviors associated with the fact that they are classified in such and such way. So racial groups are a type of interactive kind. People classified within racial categories adopt, deny, negotiate, adapt their behaviors to the category along what is expected from the categories, to adjust, to reject them, and thereby contribute to render the categories contextualized, historicized, modifiable, and shifting. This is the reason why there isn't any fixed, universal, or necessary concept of race, nor even any valid concept of race outside of the specific site and time in which it is produced, used, and discussed. A third step is necessary. For Searle, brute or raw facts have a logical priority over social facts, which give form and function to the former. For Hacking, interactive kinds ultimately aim at materialistically real objects. His analysis of childhood autism shows that in the end, the natural category of the indifferent kind, the pathology, is the referent on which the use of the concept is grounded. This is how the kind is real and not simply nominal or dynamically nominal. Both authors still give too much significance to the categories of natural sciences. Here, that would mean that race as a social construction is socially contingent, but that biological features still are key components of the construction independently from the construction, and that they have some grounding objectivity for the social construction of the categories. And my first step consists precisely in refuting that and adopting, along the lines of Ronald Sundstrom and Michael Root, some form of pluralist metaphysics according to which there are several ways for a kind to be real. In this epistemic perspective, kinds and their ontological status, nominal or real, are dependent on the epistemic field or domain in which they are used and on the phenomena studied in these fields. So the kinds of social sciences can be as real as the kinds of natural sciences, but of course they are very different. For a kind to be real, its members must be unified, they must form a systematic set and share what they call a domain-specific relationship. For instance, in biology, population is a real kind, and the domain-specific relationship on which that the members share is ascendancy line. In social sciences, the real kind race is founded on a significant domain-specific social relationship. Which one? Again, for Sundstrom and Michael Root, a social relation is significant when it rests on three unifying forces. A top-down force, the classifying act accomplished by an authority. A bottom-up force, the intentional action from the classified members. And a lateral force corresponding to the norms attached to the classifying labels used inside and outside the group. The social humankind so constructed is real when the three forces are present, or it is nominal. Race is a real social kind because it rests on these three unifying forces. It is an assigned label, it has been institutionally imposed, it is endorsed, embraced, renegotiated, rejected by members of the racial groups, and it forms a cross-sectional system with other social norms, has bearing on subjective, intersubjective, and objective expectations, interpretations, and entitlements of the members' attitudes and behaviors. So social sciences can make a legitimate use of the concept of race, and races are real objects for social sciences. As a category, race is a real kind which allows us to name and point at racial practices. All racial practices are not necessarily racist, and one should be able to use the concept of race in order to evaluate normatively the racial practices and projects, and to propose practices and projects aiming at deconstructing racial hierarchies and dominations, explaining racial dynamics, and redistributing more equally resources along racial lines. So race is neither simply an ideological construction created in order to manipulate, submit, or deceive others, but it's not the reflection of an objective natural condition, a universal fixed concept. Again, in Sally Haslinger terms, this approach, so social constructivism, recommends this. Don't look for an analysis that assumes that the category's meaning is always and everywhere the same. Rather, consider how members of the group are socially positioned and what physical markers serve as a supposed basis for such treatment. So Haslinger reaches the following definition, and I read again: a group is racialized in context C if its members are socially positioned as subordinate or privileged along some dimension, economic, political, legal, social, etc., in C, and the group is marked as a target for this treatment by observed or imagined bodily features presumed to be evidence of ancestral links to a certain geographical region. End of definition. The conjunction of these two conditions, differentiated position in the social hierarchy that structures the context C, and observed or imagined physical markers, allows us to understand how racialized groups are not identity groups. They do not possess a substantial or unified essential identity, but they consist of different relationships. Relationships with an impact on individual identifications, intersubjective interactions, and the objective social positions of the members of these groups. In this sense, racial groups are relational. There are majority and minority racial groups, and they are differentially situated on the social ladder. According to Iris Meyer and Young, recognition of the existence of these different relationship-based social groups provides social justice with an important resource, and we meet here the normative question. And I quote Young, first, it allows us to notice structural relations of dominance and subordination among groups that raise important issues of justice for individuals. The metaphor of positioning, furthermore, helps to point to ways that individual people have similar kinds of knowledge about the workings of society, or have similar kinds of routine experiences because of the social relations and possibilities in which they act. End of quote. It is the structural positioning of groups that conditions the social and political possibilities of individuals as agents, qua members of a group. they have shared perception and common knowledge and the shared consciousness of living similar experiences, which by no means determine their individual or collective identity. Again, racial groups are not identity groupings. To talk about race does not imply anything regarding the essential nature and identity of persons. Racial groups are social, or better yet, political groups. But, and this will be my last words, saying that race is real along these lines as social reality does not mean that race is morally or politically legitimate or good. Indeed, if correctly apprehending race in a social constructivist perspective matters, it is precisely because it is fundamental to be able to evaluate right and wrong uses of race. If we accept that race is real and its reality is social, if we accept that racial groups are relational political groups, the question remains, what should we do with race? Ian Hacking underlines, although he himself regrets it, that social constructivism has an important critical aspect. He points that analyzing objects and categories as social constructions is rarely done in and for itself, but insofar it serves a critical aim. And Hacking lists three main theses usually held by constructivism. One, X, here race, need not have existed, it is not inevitable. Two, in the current state of affairs, X or X race is a bad thing. Three, the world would be much better off without race, if race was abolished or radically transformed. When racial groups are the objects of constructivism, the use of constructivism is clearly related to the will to propose this radical transformation of race. What transformation? Insisting on the irrelevance of biology that always tends to come back in the picture when race is mentioned. Biology is there's a strong tendency to use biology or natural sciences to validate or invalidate the reality of race or of the race concept, whereas precisely social constructivism insists on a transformative way of relating to race that insists on its social construction. In order to promote racial justice, that is a social and political organization of our institutions which does not systematically, directly or indirectly, disadvantage people considered as members of the racial minorities, one has to take race into account. That is, first, one has to acknowledge the existence of the category as a social interactive kind and its looping effects on members of our societies. Two, one has to acknowledge that racial groups are real, positional, and political groups. And three, one has to use race to transform the structural positioning of racial groups. That is, to reform our representations and our institutions in order to promote racial equality. Thank you.